lesson. Punk rock and hip hop music are connected. They are very similar cultures. All right, so first of all, the Ramones, they're one of the pioneers, the face of punk rock music, right? They didn't go gold. Their records didn't go gold until 40 years after. Their first gold record was in 2014, and in 2014, by that point, a majority of their members were dead. So there's a huge cultural symbiotic there's a bunch of similarities between punk rock and hip hop. Now, first of all, when you hear people say when rap first started it was a trend, everybody thought that it was a fad. What they're saying is, the science of that is, the major record labels looked at punk rock initially as something to invest in because it had a lot of cultural energy surrounding it. It was an underground thing. A lot of people were into it. And it had that vibe of being the next big thing, just like how hip-hop was in the beginning. However, when these major record labels signed these punk rock bands, they didn't sell any records, similar to hip-hop. And punk rock, they had this thing called DIY, do-it-yourself ethic. So they would press up their records independently and sell them at their concerts. So a band might press up 500 records and sell them at their concerts, and they didn't perform in the best venues. Yeah, New York City had CBGB's, Max's Kansas City, but at the end of the day, punk rock bands used to perform in the worst, smallest clubs, and they didn't get paid much. And they would perform side by side with hip-hop artists, because in the 70s, hip-hop was new, and hip-hop hadn't established itself yet. So they would find themselves performing in the same clubs. And that's basically how the major record labels even discovered what hip hop was, because they were chasing the punk bands in these little small venues, these little bars, and they would encounter hip hop artists at these same places, on these same bills. So punk rock reached its climax in 1977. That was the year of punk rock. The Ramones, the Sex Pistols, and all of that. The record labels thought that if something has a bunch of cultural energy and a lot of enthusiasm, and it seems like a lot of people like it, that would be perfect to invest in. Okay, punk rock, a lot of the kids love it. The bands, hey, we're going to invest in it. And mind you, just like hip-hop, punk rock was looked down on because it didn't require a lot of musicianship. The reason why punk rock appealed to so many people is because you didn't have to be a master at the guitar. Most punk bands only play with 3 chords. So a lot of people who are accomplished professional musicians look down on punk rock because they look at it like basic music. And it was the same way for hip-hop, because hip-hop didn't create their own music. They weren't considered musicians. They would take the break beat of a song, somebody else's song, and they would, the DJ would just scratch over it and stuff like that. The MC, the master of ceremony, used to introduce the DJ. The MC's job was to keep the crowd occupied while the DJ was having a moment of silence while he was getting ready to do something. They would keep the crowd entertained. It was later on when that MC actually began to rap over those break beats. But they would isolate the percussion of a James Brown song or whatever, and they would, scratch with it or whatever. But so people didn't respect the musicianship of hip hop or punk rock because they were looked at as non-musicians. So that's another similarity. So after punk rock blew up in 77 and these record labels signed all these punk bands, they were disappointed because they didn't sell any records. Like I said, the Ramones came out in 76, 77, and their first gold record occurred in 2014 when everybody in the band died. So when hip-hop came along, these same record labels were hesitant because they looked at hip-hop as just another fad or trend like punk rock, because eventually punk rock branched off into other genres like new wave, the Talking Heads, for example. It didn't stay in its pure form. It turned into other things. So the record labels were like, hey, we don't want to make the same mistake as we did in punk rock and invest in something that has a lot of cultural energy and it seems to have a lot of promise, but it's just a trend at the end of the day, and people are going to grow tired of it at the end of the day, because the hip-hop guys used to dress kind of weird. They used to dress with the leather, the furs, all of these ostentatious ways of dress, just like the punk rockers. They would wear leather, have safety pins. So they looked at rap the same way they looked at punk rock, as a novelty thing that was going to wear off. You understand what I'm saying? But hip-hop and punk rock grew together, and they were friendly with each other as genres, because like I said, they were both underground. They were both ignored by the mainstream, so they would find themselves performing in the same venues and stuff like that. So there's a similar energy between punk rock and hip hop, and also they were both disrespected by professional musicians because they would be making samples and stuff like that in hip hop, and a lot of those people didn't want their song sampled because that was a huge no-no for a professional musician. You don't ever take somebody's record. You have to make your own music, your own compositions. So that's the story between punk rock and hip hop in terms of the connection between the two. Peace.